First of all, we'll kick off with a one sentence each from each of you. What are your reflections on what you've heard this morning?
The most important thing I've heard from the presentations this morning came from two people to my left, and that is the question of opportunity. The opportunity to really talk with people who are not faith, because that's kingdom building.
I was thinking, mine was, I'm very optimistic about all the possibilities, both scientific and theological, that there are for the future.
Don't be scared to wade into the discourse and inform yourself of the opposite discipline.
Thank you. Now I'm going to throw in one more question, then I'm going to hand the microphone over, and I hope it's just going to circulate amongst the three of you. It reminds me of the days where I was tutoring at Melbourne Uni, and I used to think a really good tute was a tute where I didn't have to say anything for 30 minutes because the group just took over. We'll see how they go. My question is, we've talked about Christian distinctives, things about Christian theological understandings of the human being, for example. But we're in a public space where Christianity is not, is increasingly less listened to and seen as relevant. It's all very well for us to debate Christian distinctives and what Christians have to say about these issues, but these issues are very, very public issues, and most of the people who are making decisions aren't at least strongly committed to a Christian worldview. How do Christians engage in a way that builds bridges, contributes to the conversation with Christian distinctives, but at the same time recognising that it's a very unchristianised or less Christianised sort of dialogue out there where the decisions are made?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to listen to other people. And then start to push other people about what their underlying convictions are. As you say, it's a very secular world today, but for a lot of people, they think that the notion of secular means that you don't bring religious viewpoints into debate without realising that they themselves have equivalent views that underlie what they are saying. There are some secularists who understand that they do in actual fact have a strong philosophical underpinning, whether they are able to articulate it or not. But there are a lot who don't think about that, and who think, oh, it's just logical, isn't it? We just operate logically and it'll work out. But that they need to be pushed on what, or asked kindly, but persistently, what are the underpinnings of your belief? Why do you think in that way? To explore their underpinning. And then, in turn, one can share one's own Christian ones.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that and maybe push back a little on the distinctively Christian aspect to say that I don't think Christians have a monopoly on moral understanding or on a concern for justice, and I think that if we become focused on what is our distinctive and why are we distinctive and why are we the only ones who can answer this question, then we actually maybe cut ourselves out of a lot of the conversations and kind of dilute the work we could be doing. So I think we can have those conversations where we acknowledge that everyone is operating from some underlying commitments that aren't just scientific, and kind of get to what those commitments are, and also be kind of honest and authentic about what our own particular perspective is and what informs it. But then to remember that, I guess if anything is distinctly Christian, it's a commitment to justice and equality and again, distinctively, I would maybe push back on. But what is certainly Christian is that concerns for justice and equity and those kinds of things should absolutely be informing the way we engage in these conversations.
And I'd like to underline what Vicky said with an example. So my passion for holding this day came from an event that I spoke at in Melbourne, which was a public event at the Melbourne Exhibition Convention Centre, and it was about gene editing and the ethics thereof. The audience was probably largely secular, but the questions that I was getting from that audience wouldn't be any different from questions that are already emerging today. No one said, "Are you playing God?" But they had a different way of saying it. You know, they were recognising that there were no-go boundaries that maybe one shouldn't cross. And one of those boundaries is really in the area of enhancement, which I just want to tackle a little, because this morning when I talked about CRISPR, I was very much focused on really using it to heal people that might have a genetic condition that would be life-threatening or extremely debilitating. But when you start talking about enhancement, you're talking about the traits of the type that I talked about, such as height, weight, sporting ability, behavioural aspects. And they involve typically hundreds, if not thousands, of genes. And each of those genes, let's say sporting ability, there aren't 1,000 sports genes, there are 1,000 genes that influence your sporting ability that do other things. And so if you begin to tinker with one of those genes, it's not just the trait that you're looking at that you'll be tinkering with. Furthermore, there may be more downside than upside. And of course, I've already said there could be 1,000 genes, so your impact will be minimal on the trait that you'd be trying to change. So scientifically, scientists don't even talk about that. It comes up in discussion, but scientists don't talk about creating super athletes or people who are super tall or super beautiful, super intelligent. Those questions never come from the scientific community. They come from people who really don't fully understand where the technology's at and how much it will be almost impossible to do that kind of thing.
Sometimes things come out of left field. I understand what you're saying about what scientists. Sometimes people are rather speculative of what might be possible.
Yes.
On the other hand, I did in working on the federal government gene technology ethics committee, come into contact with some fairly high-flown scientists, and on one occasion we had a conversation, and this scientist was very kindly filling me in on what he was doing that was actually very secret from his point of view. And he told me some stuff about what they were doing, and I'm going, wow, really? And I said, I guess you've got a patent on that. And he said, no, we don't have patents, we have secrets. Because once you put a patent out, you've got to tell people what it is that you're doing and how it's working. And the trick apparently from him was to avoid getting a patent until you thought somebody else might do it and you beat you to it, and then you put it out. So I think that's why sometimes things can come from left field.
Just want to bring in the AI perspective because Neil's not here, but again, to give an example of what it might look like to sort of enter into some of these debates informed by Christian faith. Everything's exploding around large language models, and as Neil pointed out, there are all those big, strong AI questions, existential ones. What does it mean to be a person? What is consciousness? Which, to a certain extent, we're equipped to have those philosophical discussions because we've been having them for centuries, even though we haven't come up with definitions of what is consciousness, and it may not be something we'll ever really arrive at. I like the emphasis that Neil put on not just the strong AI questions, but the present day, what is going on with AI now. And I talked about that spectrum of responses from Christians and non-Christian alike, of kind of running all the way from extreme anxiety to just uncritical awe. This is changing the world. I think both of those responses are actually distractions from how, if we look at large language models now, they're trained by humans on data sets created by humans, and they're exploited by humans towards very human ends. And that's a justice question, like that's an ethics question. And that's where Christians who actually, look at what, that was a very excellent explainer on what actually is ChatGPT that kind of demystifies some of it. Once we can arrive at that kind of more considered and sober understanding of what the technology actually is, then we can maybe focus on, well, what are the justice questions that people are kind of being distracted away from by the shininess and the big existential questions? And how do we look at the way these technologies are being deployed in ways to really curtail freedom or exploit people's creative work today? So yeah, that would just be another practical example.
Just an anecdote about AI. A few weeks ago in our church, our chairman of deacons was leading a service. There were a series of prayers, and somewhere in the midst of that he said they were all written by AI. I don't think many people in the congregation knew that, which made me smile. But in the last week, running this International Congress of Genetics, there was a couple of times where I was involved in using it, and one was to create images of this conference that goes back to 1899. It's like the Olympics of genetics. It moves all over the world. And with a visual artist, I was just simply saying, a landmark in London, I want people, I want modes of transport. And we did that for 23 cities around the world, and the images were just magnificent. I also found myself writing speeches for people. And so I used AI, ChatGPT, to generate first drafts. And they were really quite good. And if I'd kept working and iteratively going back to it, it would have got better and better because it's trained. But I was able to hand people these speeches that they could use as first drafts, and it simplified things. The thing that worries me about is the thing that came up is just the whole issue of privacy, and but that's a totally different dimension to the dimension that we're in at this point.
What people talk about the dangers of AI, privacy is one. Are there others that you can identify? What do you see as the danger?
I can't. It's just it's one of those lurking human fears that we have of just the unknown. I can't. But the privacy one is really obvious. When it's just clear that every time we tap into our phone, we're being watched, and the thought that data could be aggregated without your knowledge, without your control, I think is something that would be disturbing to most of us.
What about the dangers? Vicky and Brian, what do you think about the dangers?
Look, there's a lot of language around, like the AI will take our jobs. Again, I want to redirect that to that's up to humans. Like, I saw this meme the other day that was something along the lines of like, why am I doing data entry while AI is like making art and music and poetry? Like, this is not the utopian future I imagined. And like, that's absolutely right. But how do we use these tools in ways that that actually, and again, this is not a new debate. Like this is an industrialization debate. Like, all these kind of early discussions about how machines would take jobs, and isn't this a great thing because now we're going to have more leisure time, and what's happened with that? So it's almost an invitation to think again quite radically about how do we structure our societies, how do we think about income, how do we think about productivity, and what is the worth of a human, and what is a contribution. And if we buy into, I don't have the easy ways out of this. I know this sounds like radically kind of socialist and anarchist, but if we put everything in terms of value is sort of economic productivity, then AI is going to beat us in that, like, for sure. We can't compete. But if we use the opportunity to say, well, this lets us reimagine like what is a fulfilling and flourishing life, then we might surprise ourselves with how AI could help that kind of future.
I'll tow us in a different direction, and it may open up discussion among us. There's been mention this morning a couple of times about life expectancy, longevity, aging. These terms get a bit confused, but I was just looking up the figures according to the UN that in 20 years between 2019 and going back to the year 2000, so over those 19, 20 years, across the planet, the average life expectancy increased by 6 years. And life expectancy is increasing. However, there's been a recent study, it's been only in the last week, that shows that basically people, very, very few people are getting beyond a maximum age of 110. There's been a lot of dialogue about, is that the limit? The other thing I'd say is that people are living healthier for longer. They're in fact aging less. I'm coming up to 69. When my grandmother was 60, she was old. My mother was old at 60 in terms of just all of the traits of aging. And now I see women at church 80, 90 and looking a whole lot younger than they looked. So we're aging less, we are living longer, we are living healthier, but it's not clear that we can get beyond. People are saying, can we get beyond this limit that seems to be there? But it raises a second issue. I referred to those figures as being global. With the technology that I talked about this morning, there is an equity issue. So I deliberately chose to talk about sickle cell anemia, which is really common across a mid-band of Africa. And people who are African American will carry that gene and will be impacted. There are people in Melbourne who carry that gene and are being treated at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. But the people who are in Melbourne have got a much better chance of gaining any advanced care than where the vast majority of people are in the world. And some of the technologies that I've talked about cannot really be regulated because we already have, medical tourism where people go off to Thailand to have their teeth done because it's cheaper. And so it's very hard to regulate some of these technologies. And so the question of who decides, ultimately the answer to that may well be individuals. And that's where I think our dialogue needs to be, as well as with governments.
It's true. It's not entirely impossible to regulate in some respects. Yeah. Obviously, in a global context, people can go somewhere else if the regulations in a particular country don't suit them. Indeed, a number of Australians have been known for doing that in the reproductive technology field. But Australia, by and large, I don't think does too badly in terms of regulations, in terms of gene manipulation or reproductive technology and various other social issues. So there are some things that can be done.
Let me interrupt now. We'll start to think about some of the questions that are coming up. If you are a person who hasn't been able to get onto Slido, just wait, and you have a question, wave your hand at me now, just so I know if there are people in the room who would like to ask a question but haven't been able to get onto Slido. Okay, there are a couple. Thank you. Let me ask this first question, which has been upvoted by 10 people, so it's by far the most popular question. The question is, if some enhancements are to be considered, what Christian principles should guide us in drawing limits?
It's a very broad area, isn't it? Some enhancements. A fundamental question has to be asked or answered in terms of enhancements. There are those Christians who believe that God has made the world, and that's pretty much the way that it should be. And that therefore any further tinkering around and doing something different other than what God has made is not right. And therefore any medical work or any enhancement should only be aimed at returning somebody who is sick or ill or deformed or in what way, with a disability, returning them to what is considered to be the created standard. Okay, so that's one view, that God has made the world, and what we aim to do is to get back to that view. So if you take that fundamental theological view about God's creation and about the image of God, and that is a fixed thing within us, then you would probably say no to any enhancement that takes a person beyond what is already found in the world. You should not get 7 feet tall. You shouldn't, have muscle development that's going to turn you into Superman. You shouldn't develop brain with artificial intelligence implanted. Okay. So if there's going to be any enhancement, you then have to have a theology that says what God has done is not necessarily the final, the end. You need, rather than a creational theology, you need more of an eschatological theology, which says that the image of God in people is a dynamic and possibly changeable thing, that it's not just a fixed thing, that God is calling us to move on with, that God has given us brains and abilities and scientists in order to develop and take us on to new things. And if you then open up the door for enhancements, you then have to go to a second step and say, well, what are the principles that will guide the specific development? Is it okay to live to 140 years old or 160? Are we going to put a limit on it at 200, or do we just say, well, it'll just go with whatever can be done? We're nowhere near that second level, of course. We're still struggling with the first level, creational theology or eschatological.
I've got two perspectives on that, and one is imagining that you can create some so-called enhancement. From a Christian perspective, it would be very important that those that don't have that enhancement are not seen as outsiders. And we can see examples of that have occurred in my lifetime with the fashion industry, that defined what was the ideal shape for women. And people left feeling like, well, that wasn't their body shape, therefore they were non-ideal, they were on the outer side. And so, I think we have to be always with the outsider, because that's where Jesus was, and so that's got to be a perspective. And the other thing is, again, this question of equity. Good should be shared. That must be surely a Christian principle. So that's how I come at it.
I think both of you have already kind of covered the equity question and the justice question, which I think is foundational. And that would be operating within that sort of second paradigm Brian was talking about of, there is a certain amount of freedom and not necessarily a very kind of narrow fixed band of what is it to be human. It does just make the task of discernment a whole lot more difficult than if we had a very clear boundary. But I also we've been talking about enhancement and also healing or therapy, and one of the things that comes up in this space is trying to disentangle those two things is also really difficult, because most of the things that we might develop for the purposes of therapy can also function as enhancements. So just to give a couple examples, like we use all kinds of medications, like modafinil is a particular medication that helps people concentrate. Perhaps they have a diagnosed condition of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. If you do not suffer from that condition, you can still take modafinil and it will really help you concentrate, and people take it to help them with exams and all kinds of things. So what is developed as a therapy can also kind of lift the functioning and the level beyond what we might argue is normal. And again, normal is a difficult concept there. The other example would be something like people with prosthetic limbs are very soon going to be able to run 100 metres faster than people with 2 human legs, right? And no one's saying that we shouldn't use prosthetic limbs to restore a certain function, but restoring and therapeutic kind of interventions can then often restore to what is beyond kind of the normal level. So I just kind of want to point out that that's not a neat distinction, but Phil seems like he's got something to say on that.
There's something I have to jump in on, because there's been a lot of dialogue about trans athletes competing as women. Very interesting, because they've got some advantage. But there are other sorts of advantages, and I was really interested that Kate Campbell came out, and one of our great 100-metre swimmers, sprint swimmers, commenting on people bringing advantage into the pool. But if Kate Campbell were 10, 20 centimetres shorter, she would never have been a great swimmer. And you could have regulations that say that if you're over a certain height, you can't be in the pool. And so we get very focused on the advantages that people have, and we like to split hairs so that we end up on the right side, the winning side.
The distinction between, but it's difficult to distinguish between therapy and enhancement. There is now, I was going to say this is a fairly trivial example compared with something like AI, but I should note for some people it's not trivial. It's how tall are you? For some people who are abnormally small, that are small of stature, that is a great problem, and sometimes that's genetic. And so, but now there is treatment to enable people, children who are growing up, to grow to a normal height, which raises the question: what is a normal height? And so there are certainly situations where a father would say, "Look, I'm 5'5" in the old money, whatever that is in the new stuff. I do not want my child to be 5'5". I'd like them to be 5'10", or 6 foot, or 6'2". Or what's normal? Where do we go? And then one could then apply that with intelligence or memory, and the possibility of enhancing people's intellectual capacity. Well, actually, and then there's the injustice issue, which we already have in the sense that some people have more access to computers than others. So there probably will be the injustice, as there is injustice in the distribution of everything else that we've got.
I'm sure you have another question. Where it probably does push back, and this is again getting to that question of what might be distinctly Christian, or at least something Christians could be advocating for, is part of the narrative in the more sort of radical transhumanist proposals is that technology will solve these problems of inequality. And it's just very apparent that it will only increase those gaps unless it comes with some kind of ethical, moral input from outside. So I think this is an answer, by saying, well, look at the way technology is currently distributed, or look at access to the types of kind of medical care that we have already. Technology itself is not going to suddenly, fix the human condition and fix the drive to accumulate and the drive to exclude. So I think that's where we can have a voice.
Let me ask this question. It's related to what we're talking about already, but it's been upvoted by 7 people, so let's hear it. How should Christians help ensure that new categories of discrimination and stigma don't arise as we as a society create and use these new technologies?
I want to be really controversial and say that sometimes Christians come up with those categories. So maybe we shouldn't do that. I think, one of the ways is by by feeling like we have the permission to school ourselves on what do these genetic technologies do, what actually is this artificial intelligence, what are these large language models. And I think having the proper information then means we're actually part of the conversation. We're not staying over here saying, oh, this is an issue of religious freedom, or this is an issue, and kind of talking in echo chambers to each other and not actually being part of, that conversation is going to go on anyway, so we may as well be part of it. I think there's a pragmatic sort of starting point there.
Amen.
I'm not sure what the answer is to what should Christians do to prevent that kind of discrimination, but I can tell you that what will happen is that Christians will divide themselves in their approach to that in the way that Christians have always divided themselves in their approach to that. That is, that there are some Christians who would like government to step in and enact laws about it. There are some Christians who would say it's up to individuals to do this. There are some who will say, well, we need to develop an ethic within the church. It's not our business necessarily to develop an ethic for everybody else, but we might be influential by developing an ethic. So I think there'll be all sorts of things happening.
And they're probably all in this room.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've just got one other word to bring onto the table: humility.
Yeah.
As Christians, we are called to be humble. And so often there is just this arrogant attitude that we've got all the answers when so clearly we do not. So let's just be honest and humble, because that's what we're called to be, and get into the game, as my two more learned colleagues to the left have said.
Thank you. The next top question, excuse me, is, and I'm not sure that we have the expertise to answer it, but let me throw it at you anyway. What do you think of this? Can we build love into the foundation of AI? There's a thought.
Can you phone New Zealand?
Yeah, that's right. What would that
No.
mean?
Partially, yes. I mean, you may be able to build in some of these principles, such as equity.
You could get it to respond appropriately.
You won't. No, it's just. It's breaking love down into its components, and some of those components may become part of the system. But will it be a loving being? I think the answer's back
love?
there. No.
You can train a dog to do certain things. Does the dog love you? Now let's not be anthropomorphic about this.
Ours do.
Yeah, I know that people say, of course he does, because they can't conceive of the dog not loving them. But does it really, and philosophically, does the dog love in the same way that a human person loves, simply because it's been trained to respond in a particular way? I'm going with no.
I think you put yourself in dangerous ground here.
Yeah.
With dogs.
Oh yeah, the dog lovers. Dog
I
lovers
want
hate
to
me.
interrupt at this moment and ask, do we have any veterinarians present who work with dogs? I know someone who spends all their life with dogs, and we've got another one here too. Well,
Excellent.
if you want to ask a question in a minute or make a comment,
Or
I
challenge him.
have the right of reply. Carry on.
I can't speak for dogs, but AI, again, this returns us to actually what is AI. And AI is trained on human data, and there have been all kinds of instances where AI has been trained and then it's been kind of left to percolate and very quickly has turned extremely racist and bigoted and hateful and all kinds of horrific things. And that is a reflection of the human data that is informing it. So if we want to contribute to, look, I mean, wildly optimistic, but the more, I guess, people are doing things like trying to be salt and light in the world more generally, the more we will be kind of balancing out or creating data that might kind of feed into a more compassionate and humane kind of artificial intelligence. Again, that seems to be a strong AI question, as if we give the AI values and then it just takes it and runs with it. But this is a conversation. There's a feedback loop there, and kind of all the data that we're all out there producing and all of our interactions online is part of what actually is training the AI to come. So.
Do you want?
From my perspective, Jesus says there's one commandment, love, and so we have to think about what that means in every single question that we face. And so it's I keep on saying these basic principles of equity, love, justice, and we have to see where those concepts take us, and humility.
I hope I don't get myself too confused with this answer, but if we're looking for where we find love and humanity and personhood, what we see at the moment is we find it built into people. It's in this physical form. And as I'm pretty much a theological, anthropological Unitarian, I think that meanness, that humanity, that personality goes along with the physical. And I don't think the two can really be separated. So just a little thought experiment. We might think about aliens, and we might think about an alien that takes a completely different physical form. Can that alien physical form take fully human value and personhood and so on? Well, at the end of the day, God can do whatever God likes, and so if God wants to do that, God can do that. But I'm not so sure that logically we should just assume that some alien in some other physical form could have that humanity that we see in a person. What I do know is that God has made humanity in this particular form. So to what extent does our physical form influence that inner nature that we have? Indeed, should I even use that kind of language to talk about something else? So where am I going with this in terms of artificial intelligence? I don't know that we should speculate too much about going too far with artificial intelligence. I'm prepared, at least at this point, to say that love and humanity and personhood is essentially bound up with a person who looks something pretty like us. I could be wrong, but that's what I see at the moment.
So, Brian, you're pushing against, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're pushing against what is often an assumption in transhumanist discussion, that the essential human being is basically the information in the brain.
Yep.
And the body is the carrier for that information.
I am.
You're
I think
saying
we're much more integrated than that, and I think the body actually plays a considerably more important part in who we are, who Brian is, than we currently perhaps normally think.
Yep.
We are theologically, in that sense, we tend towards dualism, that those two parts, the physical and the non-physical, the spiritual, are separable entities. I don't think they are.
And some people would say the Christian church has been a little bit misled by a dualistic thing because it was a nice easy model, body and soul. But actually, if you look in the Bible, we are sort of mind bodies or something more integrated. Yeah.
Yep.
And you might think about the Apostle Paul's emphasis on the body. Okay, that's just a question to Brian. I'm not making any comments myself, am I?
Oh, they were good comments, Chris. Done well.
Let me turn to Chris White. I think you had a question. Why don't you stand up and tell us?
Phil rightly mentioned improving life expectancy. Medical science has also enabled more continuing life, which has low quality in inverted commas, right through to those with extreme dementia and minimal sentience, who we as Christians rightly argue still possess the imago Dei. In the allocation of funding, health economists use the concept of QALYs, quality adjusted life years, which tend to favour the young over the old. What does the panel think Christians should say on community spending priorities on genetic developments, etc., in diseases which impact one demographic group rather than another?
We have to be, whether we would be successful or not, I don't know, but we have to be very careful about spending considerable amounts of money in technological developments while neglecting international needs that can be solved much more cheaply. That would be far better use of the money. However, our society is not very well structured for doing that. We tend not to require the people with the money to spend it in the way that is most effective for the lives of people in other countries. So I don't know how we overcome that, but it's a very good point that we could spend a huge amount of money on something when we could spend it on care for people at much simpler levels. Basic food, sanitation, and that kind of healthcare, viruses, that kind of thing.
We already do it, right?
Or you do what part?
Like spend lots of money on
Well,
relatively rare conditions.
yeah, we do. That's yeah. We'll probably continue to do so.
Yeah, again, it's not getting distracted by the shiny possibilities at the expense of present injustices. There's a whole complex layer of how we advocate for policy and spending, but I would want to say that actually, if the church is to be a foretaste of the kingdom, then we need to be modelling that in our own communities first. Like in our churches, are all people completely welcome and equal and valued, regardless of their capacities? Are we showing love in ways that say that you don't need to be well and healthy and capable and all of these things in order to be like a valued part of our community and to be loved? So again, it's super idealistic, but I think we have to start in our own churches.
I'm going to be tough. I'm going to be tough on you, John, because I know you want to say something. You might have to say it at lunchtime. We've got 5 minutes. I want to allow Max to ask his question. Do you still have that question?
I don't have a question, only comment. I'm very happy.
Okay, we'll let you make your comment at lunchtime to one or all of them too. The other thing I should say is there have been a number of questions on Slido that were roughly purely scientific questions. So we've left them behind a bit. If you do want to ask a scientific question, for example, a number were raised by Phil, a number of questions directed at Phil. Phil says, come and talk to him afterwards. He'll be happy to talk about those scientific questions. Right?
Yes. Can I say one thing about that?
Sure thing.
So I helped organise a United Nations conference on global health in Melbourne in 2009. It was on global health and the Millennium Development Goals. At the start of the millennium, governments around the world pledged a certain percentage of their gross national income to advance health in the broadest sense in the developing world. And Australia was a country that basically, through our Prime Minister of the day, made a commitment that they never ever tried to honour. But at the same time as I was running this conference, it just occurred to me, where does Australia's wealth come from? Why have we not been in recession for decades? And there's a single word, it's China. And that's a developing country that was truly developing, and because of that they needed our resources, and we were in profit from that. Well, the people at AusAid had done a calculation that if Australia was, in a benevolent sense, investing in the poorer nations around our region, if we were doing the right thing, we would never have economic difficulties. We ourselves would prosper. We would prosper by doing the right thing, not being interventionists and telling them what they had to do with the money or any of that, just being good citizens. Then there would be benefit. If we were loving, then the love would come back to us. And I think sometimes, we need to think about things in those terms of doing the right thing has its rewards, and the scripture's full of it, and that's a way that I think we need to operate.
Okay, let's finish with a slightly scientific question because it's been upvoted by lots of people. Phil, what's the latest development on mRNA technology? Will we see it as a gene therapy available to patients anytime soon?
Yes. So first of all, at this Congress, scientists are bemused. I was seeing stuff during the height of the COVID pandemic, but this mRNA thing was something that scientists had invented. Well, the go-between the DNA and the protein is the messenger RNA. And people won Nobel Prizes for it. And this week at this meeting, there was a global prize in genetics, $500,000 US, who was given to people who are working on RNA technology and genetic disease. And they've found a common type of mutation in genes is one where there is a change in one of those steps on the ladder that basically means that the protein is not produced in the RNA at all. And there's been a drug that has been produced that will actually be a cure for conditions across many, many genes caused by mutations in many genes. And that will be something that can be rolled out around the world. But there's also RNA treatments for cancer, personalised medicine, where there's going to be treatments that will be available for your cancer if you get it, because your cancer won't be exactly the same as anybody else's who ever lived. So I think we're going to see some amazing things, but technology always costs, and because technology is expensive, that's where the equity thing comes in. That's where Medicare in this country, its future is important, because that's where you get a level of equity, but also rolling it around the world. And we have issues, even during the pandemic, these giant corporations that are making vast amounts of money, with the RNA technology, would not share it with the world's #1 vaccine producer, which is India. And so there are shameful things that happen, and political leaders didn't step in and say, you've made enough money, now you have to share it. You just have to share it. There are injustices. Our country bought something like 10 times the number of doses of vaccines that we needed, and many of them just expired and rotted, and so injustice prevails, and we need to rail against it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think if we had to pick one word in terms of, quote, Christian responses to this, it is the word that I've heard is equity, that Christians have to make a lot of noise about equity. Not that others don't, but that is certainly something that Christians need to do when we have powerful means of changing human beings, changing the world. We need to make sure that those means are for the good of all people.
Chris, we would be respected for doing it.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a voice that we need to all encourage one another to be in that conversation.